Okay, I'm Clay Greenwald,
Garrett Volker.
and this is our project, Lord of the Flies: The People versus Jack Maradu. So we're looking at the 6A's rubric and the authenticity section of the rubric. Um, our learners are put into real-world scenarios where they are either they can be a lawyer, a judge, a jury member, um, a character from the novel. Even some of them take on the roles of characters from the novels. So they are in real-world scenarios that adults do in the world. The trial has several possible outcomes, so we don't really tell them, you need to argue this way or that way. They can kind of choose their arguments, choose their evidence they're going to use, and hopefully get the verdict they want in the trial, whether Jack, a character from the novel, is guilty or not guilty. They present to an audience of peers and staff members here at our school. I think we would probably score ourselves in the acceptable, maybe into exemplary. I think a way to get farther into exemplary would probably be to have more adult outside evaluators at the end. So that's something that we're going to work on in the future, but I would say acceptable in that category.
So, in regards to adult connections, we as facilitators simulate the role of judges, lawyers, and jurors. When kids needed workshop on how to develop an opening statement, we would kind of take on the role of a lawyer and kind of how they would address the issue of creating and establishing an opening statement. So we took on that role rather than going out. But we did have our learners visit the Coppell Courthouse, where they had the opportunity to have a question and answer session with a local magistrate, and they asked her questions about kind of the trial process. So we did get them outside of the classroom to kind of connect with our community as well as connect to experts. So in that category, Clay and I scored ourselves as acceptable.
Okay, academic rigor. There is a clear driving question. We actually have, I think, 2 to 3 driving questions, but they all center around the idea of abuse of power and how government affects people within that government, how different styles of government affect people. It does demand a knowledge of Lord of the Flies, obviously, but also historical figures and different governmental styles in history, because in the actual trial, they have to present evidence from both Lord of the Flies and historical information that we've covered. So they have to annotate along the way. They use close reading strategies, deals with theme development in the novel and how that contributes to the plot. We talk about different historical figures and governmental styles, and then in the trial itself, they have to use the evidence and take on a specific viewpoint, whether they think Jack is guilty or not guilty, depending on whether they're on the prosecution or defense. So we scored ourselves in exemplary in that category.
So, with regards to applied learning, there was a need to have knowledge of the novel, gathering evidence, historical figures to establish and put that towards a trial scenario. So, they took everything they learned and applied it to an actual mock trial at the end. And then they worked on trial teams as well as used evidence or individual evidence. So, they were gathering individual evidence along the way and they synthesized it together to develop their arguments. So, we scored ourselves exemplary and applied learning.
All right, active exploration. They use a limited number of sources provided by us. They obviously use the novel. We use different resources from history, looking at different figures and governmental styles. We use some outside resources as far as trial procedures and writing opening and closing statements and different objections they can throw out during the trial. But they are provided by us, so because of that fact, we scored ourselves an acceptable. And along with there's a section of the rubric talks about interviews and gathering information from outside sources. Going back to our Q&A at the courthouse, they did have an opportunity to interview a judge and ask questions of a judge to kind of get a better idea of what goes on in a courtroom and in a trial scenario, but acceptable in that category.
And as for assessment practices, we had consistent formative assessments throughout the project through journaling activities for Lord of the Flies as well as history. They had annotation checks throughout where we checked and made sure that they were taking close notes of things that were happening in the novel that could support Jack or be in the prosecution for Jack. Additionally, we had consistent benchmark meetings, whether it be for historical evidence gathering or literature. Summative assessments, we had 2 major tests and a culminating exhibition of evidence, which was applied to a real-world scenario, which would be our mock trial, where they took their arguments and synthesized them and created their position on Jack.
And we're at our 5-minute mark, so that's it.